Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a Rome that didn't smell entirely like marble and glory, though it probably wanted you to think it did. So settle in, dim the lights, let your shoulders fall a little, and let's float toward one of antiquity's more curious institutions, the Vestal Virgins, a group of women who, despite the serene title, lived lives that were equal parts sacred privilege and politely contained anxiety. Because nothing says sleep well quite like ancient religious obligations with extremely dramatic consequences. So let's wander quietly through their world. No rush, just a soft walk through early Rome, where smoke curled from temples, sandal soles scuffed the forum, and 6 women kept the entire metaphysical stability of the Roman state going. Or so everyone believed. The Vestal Virgins belonged to the cult of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and when you hear hearth, you might imagine something cozy, maybe a fire crackling while someone says something profound about soup. But for the Romans, the hearth wasn't about warmth. It was about the absolute spiritual survival of the city. The fire of Vesta represented Rome's life force, the literal flame, the symbolic flame. The if this goes out, everyone panic politely flame. So the Vestals weren't just priestesses, they were essentially living insurance policies. Human fire alarms in white robes. They were chosen as children, usually between 6 and 10, which already tells you plenty about Roman priorities. If you're wondering why Rome thought children were the ideal candidates to safeguard a metaphysical fire for 3 decades, it's because Rome liked its traditions ancient, its rules strict, and its logic slightly questionable. They believed young girls, untainted by past family ties or political alliances, were the purest vessels for sacred duty. Also, they were impressionable. Rome adored impressionable. Once selected, the girls were led away from their families in a formal ceremony that probably felt part holy, part unsettling. The moment they stepped over the threshold of the House of the Vestals, they were no longer daughters. They became property of the state. Their new parent was Rome itself, which, to be fair, was an ambitious father figure. Terrifying too, but ambitious all the same. The first decade of their service was training, essentially priestess school. They learned rituals, chants, the law of the cult, fire maintenance techniques, and how to avoid doing anything that might accidentally anger several dozen gods at once. They learned how to tend the sacred fire, never letting it die. They learned how to perform purification rites, how to prepare offerings, and how to embody an idealized version of Roman womanhood that real Roman women were never quite expected to live up to. Always helpful to set impossible standards by appointing professionals. The second decade was the core of their duties. The working years, the professional fire-tending phase, if you want to put it on a resume here. They were responsible for rituals so old and obscure that even Romans sometimes shrugged at the details. But everyone agreed they were important. Because tradition is often just a long-running habit, no one has the courage to question. The third decade was their teaching stage. The retirement before senior Vestals trained the next generation. Likely with the weary tone of someone who has spent 20 years making sure a symbolic fire doesn't decide to ruin their entire life. Now, you may be wondering, did they actually do much besides fire maintenance? The answer is, absolutely. Their role expanded far beyond the temple. Vestal Virgins were unique in Rome. They held a level of legal and social privilege that normal women, even wealthy ones, could only dream of. Vestals could own property. They could run their own affairs without a male guardian. They had front row seats at important games. They could free condemned prisoners simply by touching them. They rode in carriages normally reserved for high officials, and their testimony in court carried enormous weight. But of course, because this is Rome, land of the wildly contradictory, all that power came paired with equally immense expectations. The biggest rule: they had to remain virgins for the full 30 years. This wasn't just a casual guideline, it was the rule, the one carved into the foundation of their identity. Their purity was believed to be directly linked to the protection of the state. A single personal misstep could, at least in theory, send the gods into a tantrum and Rome into chaos. That's a lot of pressure for a group of people who were chosen before they even knew long division. So yes, the expectations were high. The consequences, severe. Breaking the vow meant being buried alive. Gently, ceremonially, but still buried. Rome prided itself on being symbolically humane. They wouldn't technically spill a Vestal's blood. They considered that far too indecent. Instead, they placed her in an underground chamber with a little food, a little water, and a little lamp. We didn't kill her, they could say. We just arranged circumstances in which she definitely wouldn't remain alive for long. Classic Roman moral gymnastics. The man involved, meanwhile, got beaten to death in public. Rome was nothing if not egalitarian in its misery. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate the psychological environment this created. These women carried enormous symbolic weight. Every mistake, real or imagined, risked being interpreted as a sign that the gods were unhappy. If the Tiber flooded, must be the Vestals. If crops failed, probably the Vestals. If a politician lost a debate, unlikely, but still possibly the Vestals. It was a stressful job, wrapped in white robes, but stressful all the same. Still, the Vestals were respected, even feared, in a reverent way. When they walked through the forum, crowds parted. People lowered their voices. Soldiers sheathed their weapons. It was like watching holiness glide by, wearing slightly uncomfortable sandals, and their home reflected their status. The house of the Vestals was one of the most prominent residences. In Rome, a beautiful courtyard home behind the Temple of Vesta. It had fountains, gardens, art, and probably a level of quiet supervision that felt a bit like living in a luxurious fishbowl. Inside, their days were filled with ritual rhythms, morning offerings, fire maintenance, ceremonies, special tasks on holy days. Every year, they participated in the Vestalia, a festival during which Rome honored Vesta, and all ovens and mills were cleaned thoroughly, which must have been refreshing for everyone who baked bread professionally. They kept wills for aristocratic families. They oversaw sacred objects no one else could even look at. They guarded state treasures, including, allegedly, the Palladium, a mysterious ancient artifact that Rome insisted was hugely important, but never let anyone inspect too closely. It was the ancient equivalent of a password no one wants to admit they lost. Their presence symbolized order, stability, purity, continuity, the kind of qualities Rome desperately wanted everyone to believe it possessed, even when it was busy having political meltdowns every Tuesday. Now, despite all this expectation, the Vestals did get one reward at the end of their 30 years. Freedom, full freedom. A retired Vestal could marry, and many did, though their suitors tended to be the kind of men who enjoyed saying, "Yes, my wife served the gods for 3 decades at dinner parties." Others remained single, enjoying the rare independence Roman society otherwise denied women. After 30 years of enforced purity and symbolic responsibility, many may have simply wanted a quiet villa, some peace, and 0 flaming metaphors to maintain. The Romans believed retired Vestals brought good fortune to their households, a comforting thought, though whether the Vestals preferred being symbols of good luck or simply wanted to take a nap is unclear. Let's drift a little deeper into their world, but without rushing, because the story moved softly here, like the crackling ember of the sacred fire they watched so carefully. The idea of sacred virgin priestesses wasn't unique to Rome. Many ancient cultures linked purity with divine service, but Rome made it bureaucratic. Rome made everything bureaucratic and added a legal framework so intense it could make modern contract lawyers sweat slightly. By the late Republic, the Vestals had become woven into the fabric of Roman political life. Their support of omens, rituals, or key public ceremonies could influence public opinion. Politicians knew that, if a Vestal said the gods were displeased, the Senate tended to perk up immediately, not because they feared divine wrath, but because they feared looking bad in front of voters who feared divine wrath. During trials, a Vestal's word could sway entire cases, not always fairly, but always powerfully. One can imagine the pressure of being questioned in court, while the entire room silently chants Dan T. Ruin this for the empire. Yet, despite all this prominence, their emotional lives remain mostly invisible to us. Ancient writers liked to describe their duties, their punishments, their political involvement. They rarely paused to describe them as people. Young women who entered a job with impossible expectations and lived in the quiet glow of a fire that was never allowed to fade. And so, as we drift through their world, we can imagine the rhythm, the soft footsteps on marble floors, the rustle of white cloaks, the quiet murmurs of ritual phrases spoken at dawn, the glow of a flame tended by careful hands. No urgency, just the slow pulse of tradition. We'll stay with Rome a little longer, but for now, let's rest gently with the image of the temple fire. burning steadily, watched over by 6 figures wrapped in ritual calm. Because the Vestal Virgins, for all their strange burdens and contradictory privileges, were at the center of one of the ancient world's most enduring symbols, a flame that never sleeps. And from here, we'll drift toward the next royal or elite misadventure. Softly, of course. Let's settle back in, take a slow breath, let the day fold itself away somewhere soft, and let's drift a little deeper into the quiet, white-robed world of the Vestal Virgins, a community that lived right at the intersection of divine symbolism, rigid law, and the occasional deeply uncomfortable public spectacle, because of course they did. This is ancient Rome we're talking about. After all, subtlety was not their strongest architectural pillar. Tonight, we're wandering gently through the peculiar privileges, contradictions, and odd social consequences of being one of the most important and most scrutinized women in Roman society. Think of it as a nighttime stroll through a world where religious symbolism met daily life, and where everything had rules, many rules. Rules that were sometimes strict, sometimes bizarre, and occasionally written in a tone that suggests the lawmaker had not slept enough. So let's drift in. The Vestals' lives were a study in opposites. On one hand, they were honored beyond almost any woman in Rome. On the other, they lived under a regime of purity so stiff it made marble look flexible. They were both exalted and controlled, revered and restricted, trusted symbolically, doubted practically. Rome, as usual, liked its paradoxes to be neatly symmetrical. We touched earlier on their extraordinary legal status, and it really was extraordinary. For the average Roman woman, life came with a permanent male guardian attached, like a legal shadow. A father, husband, brother, cousin, conveniently available uncle, or, in the sadder cases, that one family member everyone preferred not to mention but whose name kept popping up at wills. Women were legally tethered, unless you were a Vestal. A Vestal operated independently. She could buy property, she could write contracts, she could adopt children, she could manage her finances. In a society where the default assumption was that women required guidance, Vestals were treated as competent adults, mostly because the state had already invested too much in them to pretend otherwise. And perhaps most remarkably, they had legal protection so strong it bordered on mystical. Anyone harming a Vestal could be executed on the spot. If a Vestal walked past a condemned prisoner on the way to execution and happened to claim the omen was unfavorable, the man went free. No debate, no paperwork. The guards just shrugged and said, "The gods have spoken," even if the gods had simply been represented by a 32-year-old woman with a headache. But to balance all these privileges, the Vestals also lived under a microscope. Not metaphorically, literally. Rome's obsession with their behavior was so intense that even dropping the sacred fire for a moment was considered a bad omen. Accidental negligence could lead to punishment, not always lethal but rarely pleasant. The fire could go out for any number of reasons. A sudden gust of wind, a distracted novice, an accident involving someone's overly ambitious robe, hem. But Romans were not the type to say, well, these things happen. No, they needed meaning. They needed divine intention. So if the flame sputtered and died, people whispered, what did the Vestal do wrong? Which was a fantastic way to increase workplace anxiety. The Vestals responded by performing a purification ritual, which usually calmed the public, unless the public was feeling particularly excitable that week, in which case nothing calmed them, not even free grain. Still, daily life was not all ominous symbolism. There were slow mornings, quiet rituals, the scent of incense drifting through marble halls. The house of the Vestals had wide courtyards with cool fountains, each surrounded by porticos where the women often walked or studied. And while the environment had the soft echo of solemnity, it was also a home, albeit one with more consequences than comfort. Their tasks extended beyond the temple. They kept documents, wills, treaties, and sacred objects. Think of them as Rome's spiritual archivists. They had a hand in major ceremonies, the opening and closing of the year, purification rites, fertility rituals, festivals involving donkeys wearing flower garlands. Yes, really, Rome had its whimsical moments, and because their presence conveyed good luck, Romans sometimes waited for a Vestal to appear in public before performing major acts. A general might postpone a triumph until a Vestal could attend. A magistrate might delay reading omens. Weddings could be rescheduled. Court hearings sometimes paused awkwardly, like "Are we?" waiting for a holy woman, or shall we proceed? Their influence, though quiet, was woven through Rome like threads of white wool, pure, essential, and slightly overburdened. Now, we should pause for a moment and consider the emotional reality of this life. A girl chosen at 6 or 7 would be brought into a world of rituals she didn't fully understand yet. Her childhood ended on the temple threshold. Her parents surrendered legal authority over her. Her world became an institution that celebrated her symbolic value more than her personhood. And yes, she gained protection, status, independence, eventually, but the early years, those were devoted to learning thousands of ritual details, memorizing chants, aligning gestures with astronomical calendars, mastering purification rites, and understanding the temple's rules that existed not just in law but in layers of superstition and cultural expectation. She also slept under the constant awareness that a mistake could be interpreted as divine anger, which is a stressful bedtime thought for any age. But despite the pressure, some Vestals genuinely seemed to have enjoyed their position. They had front row seats at events. They were treated with honor. They were not bound to marriage or childbirth, to expectations that Roman women normally couldn't escape. Many had wealth and influence equal to high-ranking male officials, and after 30 years, they emerged into life with a reputation so respected that people wanted them involved in almost everything. They were the celebrities of pious living, without the intrusive gossip columns, but with all the public attention. Yet the attention had a darker side, because nothing invited scandal in Rome quite like someone questioning a Vestal's purity. We need to discuss the punishments more softly now, because while they were dramatic historically, we're here in bedtime mode, where even the awful things are held at a distance, like observing storm clouds from far away. Punishment for violating the vow was burial alive. Yes, but it was also extremely rare. Romans loved the spectacle, but they also loved pretending things were fine. Executing a Vestal was a sign that the gods were angry, which reflected badly on the government. So officials avoided accusations unless absolutely necessary, or politically convenient. Rome was always a fan of convenient timing. Most of the time, alleged misconduct was part of broader anxieties, war, famine, corruption, omens that looked funny. So the Vestals sometimes became scapegoats. If something went wrong in the empire, accusing a Vestal was a quick way for officials to say, "Look, we fixed the supernatural problem," even if the supernatural problem never existed in the first place. Again, the paradox. Vestals were sacred, and also politically vulnerable. And yet, beneath all this symbolism and tension, daily life continued quietly. They rose early. They dressed in simple white robes. They made sacrifices at the temple hearth. They kept the flame bright. They oversaw offerings, sang ancient hymns, prepared sacred grain, and tended a ritual that stretched back to Rome's earliest legends, even before kings, before consuls, before Senate debates that lasted too long. Every flame they kept alive was a link to the mythical hearth of early Roman households, a reminder that the city's strength was, at least spiritually, domestic, ordered, feminine, stable. Which brings us to one of the more curious aspects of Vestal symbolism. Rome associated them with fertility. Yes, these permanently chaste women were symbols of fertility. You can blame ancient metaphor logic for that one. The hearth fire symbolized the continuity of the household, and household continuity meant lineage, and lineage meant fertility. So Vestals frequently played roles in ceremonies meant to protect crops, ensure healthy births, and secure blessings for newlywed couples. There's something gently ironic about that. Women forbidden from love and family life helped bless other people's marriages and children. Rome loved its contradictions, served with a ceremonial flourish. During certain festivals, the Vestals prepared mola salsa, a sacred salted flour, made from grains they harvested during the Vestalia. It was used in sacrifices throughout the year, binding the Vestals to Rome's agricultural success. So yes, they were spiritual guardians, legal exceptions, elite symbols, and also part-time sacred bakers. Let's drift for a moment into the imagery of their home. The house of the Vestals sat near the Forum, a large, impressive residence with symmetrical courtyards, tiled roofs, statues of former chief Vestals lining the walkways like dignified marble aunties, silently judging everyone. A long pool reflected sunlight in delicate patterns, which must have been soothing on quiet afternoons. Rooms branched off the courtyards, sleeping quarters, storage rooms, workspaces, archives. It was peaceful, but not idle. The place had the soft hum of constant religious function, footsteps carrying water, murmured prayers, the gentle clink of ritual instruments, and above everything, a sense of controlled order. People imagined it as serene. But serenity enforced with strict ritual rules becomes something else, a kind of stillness that expects perfection. Still, the Vestals did find moments of leisure. They attended banquets. They were gifted beautiful jewelry and fine clothing, though mostly for ceremonial use. They traveled for certain festivals. They had servants, and they sometimes interacted with high-ranking officials, giving them a vantage point into elite political life, a sphere most Roman women never touched. Some Romans even believed that Vestals carried a sort of spiritual shield around them. If a criminal ran into their presence, he couldn't be dragged away forcefully until the Vestal permitted it. This made them walking sanctuaries. Ancient Rome's embodiment of the concept, I am not involved in this, but apparently the gods think I am now. There are stories of Vestals accidentally stepping between angry crowds and condemned men, rescuing people simply because they wandered into the wrong argument. A chaotic but charming image, really. As we float through this soft-lit exploration, let us touch on one last paradox. The idea that Vestals were both guardians of tradition and, in small ways, quiet rebels against Roman gender norms. Their very presence in public life contradicted the usual expectations of Roman womanhood. They oversaw rituals normally performed by male priests. They signed contracts without male oversight. They were honored by senators. They attended games in seats rivaling magistrates. They spoke in court with authority. They represented purity, yes, but also autonomy, a kind of independence that normal Roman women could never access. Some scholars believe this made the Vestals both respected and slightly unsettling to Roman society. Ordinary women were expected to be modest, private, obedient. Vestals were public, authoritative, and spiritually powerful. They were the exception that allowed the rule to stay in place, the symbolic justification for denying agency to others. Rome pointed at the Vestals and said, "Look, women have a place in public life," while quietly whispering, "But only these 6, and please don't ask for more." Yet many Vestals carved meaningful lives for themselves within this institution. Some wrote, some advised generals, some managed estates, some became mentors, some lived into old age with reputations strong enough to make emperors nervous. And perhaps the most telling detail, when the Vestal order was finally abolished in the 4th century CE, after nearly 1,000 years, many Romans mourned it, not because they believed the fire literally protected the city, though some probably still did, but because the Vestals had become a symbol of Roman identity itself. Their presence meant continuity. Their rituals meant tradition. Their home meant memory. When the fire went out for the last time, it was like closing the door on the city's childhood. So as we settle again into the quiet of the evening, let's picture the Vestal virgins not as stern, distant priestesses, but as human figures moving gently through a world of duty, symbolism, and expectation. Women whose lives were shaped by ritual flames, sacred laws, and the constant gaze of a city that both honored and constrained them. Their story drifts softly across the centuries, a reminder that even in ancient Rome, with all its noise, battles, and marble swagger, there were places of quiet, courtyards where the only sound was the soft crackle of a sacred fire, halls where white-clad figures moved like calm silhouettes. Lives lived at the slow, steady pace of ritual. And with that, we'll drift onward, gently, toward our next chapter of historical oddities and elite misadventures. Settle in again, let the room dim a little more, let your thoughts loosen at the edges. Because tonight we're gliding gently into the Middle Ages. An era full of kings' plagues, elaborate hats, and recreational activities that frequently ended with at least one person lying on the ground wondering when the fun part would begin. Yes, we're talking about medieval games and sports. A world where entertainment was enthusiastic, occasionally noble, often muddy, and sometimes involved sharp objects that truly didn't need to be there. But of course they were. Because nothing delighted medieval people more than transforming a casual pastime into something life-threatening. So let's drift softly into the meadows, tilting fields, and smoky taverns of medieval Europe, where playtime came with its own unique mix of joy, chaos, and accidental dental removal. When we imagine medieval leisure, the mind often jumps straight to tournaments, gleaming knights thundering across a field, lances pointed, banners fluttering, horses attempting not to take the entire situation personally. And yes, tournaments were important, but medieval recreation was far broader, far stranger, and often far pettier. People played games for social bonding, for status, for amusement, and sometimes because they were bored and there wasn't much else to do besides pray, farm, or be mildly uncomfortable about everything. So, as we wander forward, picture a medieval village, lanterns glowing, smoke drifting from hearths, chickens wandering wherever chickens want to wander, and somewhere nearby, a group of men enthusiastically trying to hit each other with sticks in the name of sport. A gentle era, truly. Let's start softly with the most iconic form of medieval entertainment, the tournament. Tournaments were originally chaotic brawls known as mallies. A mally was, essentially, a large-scale mock battle in which multiple knights fought at the same time. Mock is doing a lot of work in that sentence. These weren't rehearsals. They were sprawling, dangerous free-falls that could stretch for miles, spilling across fields, streams, and unsuspecting farmland. Knights charged, knights tackled, knights occasionally forgot it was just a sport and tried to injure each other with the cheerful enthusiasm of men who believed medical care was optional. But mallies also served a purpose. They trained knights for actual warfare, they forged alliances, they showcased strength, and they allowed young nobles to show off in front of crowds, while hoping no one noticed the horse they borrowed looked slightly annoyed about everything. Only later did tournaments evolve into smoother, more dignified events, the joust being the centerpiece. The joust was elegant, in a you might be thrown out of your saddle at high speed kind of way. Two knights charged at each other with lances, trying to shatter them on their opponent's shield or armor. Points were awarded, cheers rose. Nobles in stands fanned themselves politely, while quietly wondering how many bones the knights would break this time. Despite the danger, or because of it, the joust became the medieval spectator sport. If knights were the celebrities, jousters were the action stars. Amid the armor glinting in sunlight, the flowing caparisons on horses, and the dramatic impact of lance against shield, the medieval world felt a rush of excitement. Controlled excitement, of course, carefully managed, ideally with fewer fatalities than last year. Tournaments also came with ceremony, heraldry everywhere, trumpets announcing participants, ladies presenting favors, ribbons, scarves, embroidered tokens that knights wore as symbols of chivalric devotion. Romance existed here, tucked beneath layers of steel and mild concussion. Yet even at their most polished tournaments carried a certain medieval attitude. Everything is more enjoyable if danger is involved, naturally, but knights weren't the only ones at play. Let's drift from the noble spectacle into the village square, where everyday people enjoyed games that required fewer horses and significantly less armor. One of the most popular pastimes was archery, not because people found it relaxing, though some surely did, but because kings insisted on it. English rulers, in particular, were so dedicated to producing competent archers that they passed laws requiring men to practice regularly. This meant that many medieval Sundays began not with a leisurely stroll but with mandatory arrow flinging. Imagine the scene, villagers drawn from their homes, bows in hand, aiming at distant targets while thinking mostly about lunch. It was exercise, duty, and community bonding rolled into one. And since medieval diets weren't exactly known for promoting exceptional muscle tone, archery also doubled as cardio. Another widespread activity was quarterstaff fighting, which was exactly what it sounds like. Two people hitting each other with long sticks until one of them reconsidered their life choices. It was considered a gentlemanly sport, the medieval equivalent of casually sparring at the gym, though the bruises were often substantial enough to form their own identities. But if we're floating gently into the realm of chaotic fun, we need to address one of the strangest and most beloved medieval sports, mob football. Mob football was enthusiastic. That's a diplomatic way of saying it was a town-wide brawl disguised as a sport. Instead of two teams, there were two entire populations. The ball was often more symbolic than functional, and the field stretched across streets, rivers, barns, and occasionally through someone's unfortunate vegetable garden. The objective varied by town. Sometimes it was to push the ball to a specific location, sometimes to a rival village, sometimes simply to keep it away from the other side until everyone gave up. The game had no standard rules, no time limits, no player limit, no quiet whistles or organized plays. Just a large, determined mass of medieval citizens, happily shoving each other in the name of communal enjoyment. Medieval governments frequently banned mob football for being disorderly, dangerous, and terrible for property. Naturally, the bans never worked. If anything, they made the games more exciting. Now, let's drift slowly into taverns and halls, where indoor games thrived, because medieval people loved board games, and dice games, and card games. Once cards finally arrived in Europe, causing the kind of moral panic only card games can cause. One of the oldest and most beloved games was tables, an ancestor of backgammon. Players moved pieces around a wooden board, rolling dice, gambling, and occasionally pretending they understood probability better than the gods did. Monks complained about dice playing, clergy frowned at gambling. Naturally, everyone kept doing it anyway. Chess, too, became popular, especially among nobles who enjoyed games that involved strategy, hierarchy, and the ability to say, "I outsmarted you" in elegant phrasing. Medieval chess pieces looked different from today's. Queens were originally viziers, bishops were elephants or ships, and rooks were chariots. But the basic idea was the same: a battlefield on a board, perfect for a culture that loved symbolism almost as much as it loved arguing about inheritance laws. Taverns hosted drinking games, storytelling contests, singing competitions, and occasionally wrestling, which usually began as a friendly challenge and ended with someone being gently but firmly sat on. And where taverns thrived, so did dice. Dice games were played everywhere by peasants, merchants, knights, and even clergy. Despite frequent official reminders that holy men should not gamble, which holy men proceeded to ignore with quiet determination, dice were small, portable, and dangerously tempting. Wagers could be money, food, property, or the medieval classic, pride. One of the more infamous games was hazard, a complex dice game that produced more emotional devastation than actual strategy. People played it in alleys, at fairs, behind barns, and sometimes while insisting they were absolutely not gambling, just casually rolling dice next to a pile of coins that looked suspiciously like a bet. Let's move outdoors again, gently, toward something that feels a little calmer. Bowls, or lawn bowling, were surprisingly popular. People rolled weighted balls toward a target, the jack in fields or cleared village spaces. It was quiet, competitive, in a soft way, and occasionally interrupted by someone tripping over uneven ground. Kings loved it, peasants loved it, nobles played it wearing clothing that definitely did not allow for free movement. But because this is the Middle Ages, even bowls became controversial. The English monarchy worried that bowls distracted men from practicing archery, so at various times, kings banned bowls as well. Imagine being a 14th century villager. You've survived winter, paid your taxes, avoided infectious diseases, and now, the king says you can't roll a wooden ball across a field because he's very concerned about your archery skills. Medieval life was balanced on a delicate scale of stress and recreation, and that recreation was always one law away from becoming illegal. Another calm pastime was falconry, a sport of the elite. Nobles trained hawks to hunt small animals. It was graceful, elegant, and involved birds with attitudes strong enough to humble even the proudest baron. Falconry required patience, skill, and equipment that suggested the bird was going on a long diplomatic mission. But falconry also created social hierarchy. The type of bird you were allowed to own depended on your class. Peasants couldn't own falcons, but they might keep kestrels or sparrowhawks. Kings had the best birds, dukes slightly worse birds. Lower nobles had respectable but not particularly impressive birds. Sumptuary laws governed feathers. Apparently, medieval society loved rules so much they were willing to micromanage birds. As we drift further, softly and steadily, we reach one of the most medieval sports imaginable: hunting. Hunting wasn't just a pastime, it was political theater. Nobles hunted to demonstrate status, prowess, and their right to control land. Deer parks, forests, and hunting preserves were jealously protected. Peasants caught poaching could face harsh penalties, even if the only thing they poached was a rabbit, unfortunate enough to hop near a lord's estate. Hunting came with rituals: horns, dogs, special clothing, ranked positions within the hunting party. And the animals weren't always willing participants, though boars, in particular, enjoyed turning the tables. Medieval boar hunting was the sort of sport that guaranteed either a satisfying feast or an afternoon of regretting every decision that led to standing in front of a wild animal armed with tusks. Finally, let's drift into one of the gentlest corners of medieval recreation: music, storytelling, and games of the mind. Troubadours sang ballads, minstrels entertained travelers, people told riddles, long winding riddles that sometimes sounded more like gentle threats. Medieval society valued memory, so riddle games were popular, encouraging players to recall obscure lore, saints' lives, plant names, or proverbs that sounded wise even when they weren't. And then there were games that required physical agility but very little equipment: leaping contests, stone throwing, tug of war, foot races, and stool ball. An early ancestor of cricket, though medieval stool ball looked more like someone tried to invent baseball while not fully understanding what a ball was supposed to do. People played with whatever they had: sticks, stones, leather balls, rope, bones, and, in at least one documented case, the inflated bladder of a pig. Pig bladder balls were durable, bouncy, and smelled like exactly what they were. But medieval people weren't picky. They had limited options, and pigs were everywhere. So as we drift to the end of this gentle medieval wander, let us take a moment to picture the Middle Ages as more than cold castles and stern-faced kings. It was a world full of play, loud play, risky play, joyful play. A world where villagers gathered for lively games, nobles risked injury in shining armor, children ran after makeshift balls, and taverns echoed with laughter, dice, and the occasional argument that may or may not have ended in someone needing a bandage. It was a world where fun existed in simple forms, shaped by community, tradition, and the eternal human need to pause work, shrug off stress, and enjoy something, even if the something occasionally involved being hit with a stick. And with that soft image, torches glowing, villagers cheering, knights tilting at dusk, laughter drifting from a tavern doorway, we'll quietly leave the medieval playground behind. Hey everyone, let's settle back in. If you've been listening from the start, you've already floated through the charmingly chaotic world of medieval sports. And now we're just going to keep gliding forward softly, slowly into a few more games that existed because people in the Middle Ages had an incredible combination of boredom, limited entertainment options, and absolutely no fear of losing important body parts. So take a breath, get comfortable, and let us drift into the next batch of strangely specific hobbies that medieval people insisted were fun. Even when the description reads more like a workplace safety hazard report, the gentle art of rock throwing will start with something peaceful, something serene, something that speaks to the human desire for harmony. Naturally, I'm talking about competitive rock throwing, because of course they were doing that. Rock throwing games appeared across Europe, usually informally, usually after alcohol, and usually ending with someone deciding that their friend's face was a perfectly acceptable target. The basic idea was simple. You had a rock, you threw it. Farther was better, accuracy was optional, and survival was a bonus. Some towns even hosted seasonal festivals where almost always men would gather in what was essentially a patch of dirt and try to outdo each other by tossing increasingly unreasonable boulders. Most of these rocks were barely liftable, but prestige mattered more than back safety, and medieval masculinity required continuously proving you were capable of profoundly unwise decisions. The winners earned admiration, the losers earned lifelong shoulder injuries, and everyone else earned stories they could tell their grandchildren, assuming those grandchildren hadn't inherited the family tendency toward questionable decision-making. Let's drift over to stool ball, a medieval baseball-ish thing. Now let's float toward another game. Something gentler, something wholesome. Stool ball. Yes, stool ball. And no, that name doesn't improve with repetition, despite sounding like something an exhausted parent might grumble about after cleaning the floor. Stool ball was actually an early precursor to cricket and baseball. It's one of the oldest baton ball sports still mentioned in English records. And unlike many medieval games, stool ball was surprisingly wholesome. No broken bones were required to understand the rules. A target, often an actual milking stool, was set upright. A batter stood in front of it. Someone tossed a ball. The batter tried to hit it. If they missed, the ball could hit the stool, and that counted as being out. That was basically it. A shockingly normal activity by medieval standards, the game was popular among young people, especially girls and women. And predictably, church officials occasionally complained that too many couples were meeting during stool ball games, and then, as medieval clerics delicately put it, behaving in ways not conducive to spiritual improvement. Translation: people were flirting in public, outdoors. Outrageous stool ball eventually evolved into several regional variations, some of which still exist today, demonstrating that medieval sports weren't all violent carnivals of muscle damage. I know, I'm surprised too, when medieval chess players took it too seriously. Let's drift inside now, into the cool stone stillness of a medieval hall. Because believe it or not, chess was one of the most intense combat sports of the Middle Ages, not physically of course, emotionally and honestly. That's somehow worse. Medieval chess games could last for hours, with long contemplative silences that were occasionally interrupted by muttered curses, side-eye glances, or the sound of someone slamming a bishop down slightly harder than necessary. It was one of the few games considered appropriate for kings, clergy, and anyone who wanted to look smart without doing physical labor. The game wasn't identical to today's version, especially the queen, who moved only one square at a time. Medieval queens were apparently not allowed to demonstrate initiative, which kept the board nice and predictable until Spanish players in the 15th century decided the queen should move however she pleased. After that, she became the most powerful piece in the game, sweeping dramatically across the board, while everyone else quietly reconsidered their life choices. There are documented medieval chess tantrums, kings knocking the board over, knights arguing for hours about whether a move was legal, monks supposedly using chess to encourage restraint, which went about as well as you'd expect, because nothing brings out human pettiness like a board game that encourages you to trap someone as metaphorical king and slowly watch their position crumble while maintaining polite eye contact. Archery, the medieval pastime that accidentally created an entire class of very confident peasants. For our next stop, let's drift into the quiet, grassy range where medieval peasants practiced the one sport that actually mattered to kings: archery. Archery wasn't just a hobby, it was mandatory. English kings passed multiple laws requiring men to practice on Sundays. Not attending archery practice could result in fines, social embarrassment, or worst of all, being labeled unproductive, which was basically the medieval version of receiving a passive-aggressive email from HR. Practicing archery all day created a population of peasants who were extraordinarily good at it. So good, in fact, that longbowmen became one of the most feared forces in Europe. They were the medieval equivalent of discovering that your quiet neighbors have been casually training with advanced missile launchers for fun. Kings encouraged competitions with money, prizes, ale, and bragging rights. Archery contests became community events, complete with spectators, vendors, and that one guy who insisted he used to be a marksman before his elbow went bad. Meanwhile, the average English peasant was developing biceps that could bend a yew longbow with a draw strength comparable to a small car. But despite its role in warfare, archery competitions were often calm and orderly. You stand, you aim, you breathe, you release, and you hope your arrow actually hits the target, instead of the hay bale, the dirt, a nearby chicken, or the Lord's decorative hedge. Let's float toward medieval skittles, which is basically bowling, but wetter. Next up is skittles, the ancient relative of bowling. Imagine a long alley, 9 pins, a wooden ball, and a group of medieval villagers who have been drinking for several hours. That's skittles. Skittles alleys could be outdoors, indoors, or in taverns. And yes, you're correct in assuming that medieval tavern floors were not exactly flat, even, or sanitary, which added a strong element of chaos to every throw. You'd roll the ball. It would bounce. It would veer sharply to the left for no reason. It might hit a goat. The outcome was unpredictable, and that was part of the fun. Some places played skittles on grass, which meant rain could turn the alley into mud, meaning that sometimes the ball didn't roll, it simply stopped halfway, confused and unwilling to participate further. Despite this, skittles were wildly popular, especially among working-class men who wanted something to do after spending all day doing jobs the rest of us can barely imagine without needing a nap. The quiet spectacle of falconry. Now let's drift into something more elegant, something quiet, something medieval nobles genuinely treasured: falconry. Falconry wasn't a sport in the modern competitive sense. It was a lifestyle, a status symbol, a way for nobles to signal, yes, I have wealth, land, servants, And now I also have a bird capable of tearing apart small mammals on command. Medieval falconry manuals were surprisingly detailed. They described diets, training techniques, and remedies for hawk illnesses. Some hawks ate better than the peasants who watched them fly overhead. Falconry was slow-paced and contemplative. You walked, you waited. The bird watched you with mild disapproval. A rabbit appeared. The hawk took off. Everyone nodded sagely, as though this was all perfectly normal. And yet, falconry also created social tension. Certain birds were reserved for certain ranks. Emperors could have eagles, kings had gerfalcons, knights got peregrines, priests had sparrowhawks, peasants could observe from a safe distance. Owning the wrong bird could result in fines or worse, being politely reminded of your place in society through a long, tedious lecture about proper rank. Still, falconry was one of the rare medieval pastimes that didn't involve concussions, shouting, or setting things on fire. It was almost meditative, except, of course, for the part where an angry bird occasionally decided it was tired of instructions and flew off forever. Medieval swimming, more folklore than sport. Now we float quite literally toward medieval swimming, or rather, the medieval fear of it. Swimming was not common among Europeans during the Middle Ages. Many believed deep water contained spirits, monsters, or, more realistically, diseases. And since bathing also wasn't popular for certain centuries, water had an image problem. A few knights practiced swimming as part of their general Dante die during crusading training. Some monks wrote treatises on it, but most peasants stood near rivers, like they were observing a suspicious animal. Even so, competitive swimming existed here, and they're usually in calmer rivers, and usually among young men who were very sure of their abilities until the water became cold and their confidence rapidly decreased. The style was almost always breaststroke, which medieval writers helpfully illustrated with drawings of men looking mildly inconvenienced while floating horizontally. Nothing about medieval swimming was fast, nothing was graceful, and absolutely nothing was standardized. But this didn't stop people from having informal races, often to impress someone watching from the shore, which, historically speaking, is one of the most powerful forces behind questionable athletic choices. We'll drift now into foot races across completely unsafe terrain. Despite having few paved roads, medieval people adored foot races. Sometimes these races were horizontal, sometimes they involved hills, and sometimes, because humanity is consistently unwise, they were uphill sprints on surfaces that were mostly gravel, dirt, or slippery grass. Winners didn't always get big prizes. Sometimes it was just a ribbon or a loaf of bread. But being the fastest in the village meant something. It meant agility, strength, youth, and possibly just an unusually high pain tolerance. Some towns hosted church-to-church races. Others raced during fairs. A few very confident people attempted marathon-length distances, though medieval shoes were not exactly endurance-friendly, so blisters played a starring role. Children raced constantly, adults raced occasionally, and every so often a lord would challenge his men to a race just to demonstrate he could still move faster than the average tax collector. Foot races, unlike many medieval sports, required no equipment and minimal risk lest you consider potholes, exposed tree roots, sudden livestock appearances, or uneven village streets to be risks, which they definitely were. A soft drift toward medieval music competitions. Not all medieval contests were physical. Some were musical. Imagine a hall lit by flickering candles. Traveling musicians gather. The audience settles in with ale and expectations. The competition begins. Minstrels competed in singing, lute playing, harp playing, storytelling, or composing new verses on the spot. These performances ranged from deeply poetic to "my cousin made up this rhyme 5 minutes ago and insists it's brilliant." Musical contests could last for hours, sometimes an entire night. Judges included nobles, clergy, or whoever happened to be sober enough to make a decision. Winners could receive money, clothing, new lutes, or most valuable of all, patronage. This meant food, lodging, and the privilege of composing flattering songs about someone's noble lineage, even if that lineage was only slightly more impressive than a moldy turnip. But even in the quiet world of medieval music, drama existed. Musicians accused each other of stealing melodies. Traveling performers questioned the artistic skill of their rivals. And occasionally, someone would storm out mid-competition, offended that their masterpiece had been ranked second to a man singing about cheese. And finally, Let's drift into medieval board games after a long day of farming, fighting, or surviving. Medieval people also enjoyed quiet indoor games. Not checkers or Monopoly, those came later but older, simpler forms. Nine Men's Mories, a strategy game played on carved tables, parchment, or scratched out dirt. Players moved pieces to form lines of 3, removing opponent pieces one by one. It required patience, and the ability to avoid flipping the board when losing. Backgammon or tables are classic. Nobles and tavern dwellers loved it. Easy to learn, difficult to master, and a reliable way to ensure that two grown men would argue over dice probability for an unnecessary amount of time. Fox and Geese, a chase game where one fox tried to capture the geese. The geese moved cautiously, the fox moved boldly, and every now and then someone accused someone else of cheating, even though the whole board had only 2 types of pieces. Board games brought people together quietly, calmly, with just a hint of competitive spite. A perfect medieval evening, really. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're drifting in and out, which honestly is the ideal state for these monologues, just let your mind float while we wander deeper into the oddly imaginative world of medieval entertainment. We've traveled through rock-throwing championships, skittles, alleys, falconry fields, and enough questionable decisions to fill several occupational therapy textbooks. But there are still so many medieval leisure activities that quietly existed, usually because someone, somewhere, got bored and thought, yes, this is fun. Let's keep doing this forever. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift into even stranger pastimes, from the Middle Ages activities that range from surprisingly wholesome to softly alarming. Let's drift first toward medieval singing fights. Yes, singing fights. Before rap battles existed, medieval Europeans already had a similar idea, except without rhythm, flow, or anything that could be considered musical precision. These were called flyting in the British Isles. 2 poets stood facing each other, usually in a hall. Often after several mugs of ale and exchanged elaborate insults in verse form. A flyting match could last for hours. People gathered to watch. Judges declared winners, and the poets insulted each other's appearance, intelligence, parentage, social standing, personal hygiene, and occasionally literacy. Every insult was wrapped in poetic structure. So instead of yelling, "Your house smells like cabbage," someone would calmly announce, "Thy kitchen fumes reek sour of rotting greens, a fitting fragrance for thy witless means." Very highbrow. Even nobles participated occasionally, because nothing says I am a dignified leader like engaging in a formal poetry battle about someone's suspicious haircut. Flyting wasn't physically dangerous, but it was emotionally hazardous. One careless rhyme could haunt you for years, repeated gleefully by people who barely understood the metaphor. But for the medieval mind, this was culture, elevated culture, and people loved it. From singing fights to tumbling, the medieval acrobatics nobody asked for. Now let's gently drift toward something more physical. Medieval tumbling. Tumbling was the ancestor of gymnastics, except without mats, safety standards, or any understanding of how joints work. Tumblers performed somersaults, flips, handstands, and contortions before audiences who believed flexibility was either a gift from God or a sign you were possibly in league with demons. There wasn't much middle ground. Tumblers traveled with fairs and circuses. They performed in market squares, taverns, and occasionally in noble courts, when a lord wanted something amusing, but not too intellectual. Medieval illustrations show tumblers bending backward at angles that make modern chiropractors cringe in sympathetic pain. Children loved watching them. Adults enjoyed pretending they weren't impressed. But tumbling wasn't easy. It required training, strength, and a very casual relationship with the possibility of spinal injury. Still, it was one of the few medieval performances that appealed across all classes. A peasant and a noble could stand side by side, watching someone flip head over heels, both silently thinking, "I'm glad it's not me." Asterisk, asterisk, medieval gambling. Because of course they were doing that. Asterisk, asterisk. Let's drift to the quieter but far more emotionally charged world of medieval gambling. Medieval people would gamble on anything. Dice cards, later Middle Ages. Animal fights, foot races, archery contests, board games, which candle would burn out first, the weather, and occasionally, the outcome of someone else's romantic failures. Dice were the most popular. Of course they were. Easy to carry, easy to cheat, Easy to lose your entire week's wages before you even realized the ale had reached your decision-making abilities. Church authorities condemned gambling frequently. Kings restricted it. City officials banned it during work hours. And yet, dice games continued everywhere, from muddy village corners to castle halls. Medieval dice games had beautifully chaotic names like Hazard, Postix, Raffle, and the classic "Whoever loses must buy ale," which wasn't an official title but was definitely a widely obeyed rule. Players accused each other of using weighted dice. Fights broke out. Friendships ended. And yet everyone kept playing, because risk, apparently, is timeless. Asterisk, asterisk, let's glide over to medieval dancing, which was somehow both strict and wild. Asterisk, asterisk. Medieval dancing could be divided into two types. Noble dancing, everyone else dancing. Noble dancing involved slow, elegant movements, hands held carefully, eyes lowered, steps small and controlled. A noble dance was essentially coordinated walking, performed by people who desperately wanted to look graceful but were wearing 40 pounds of brocade. Common folk dancing, on the other hand, was energetic, communal, and sometimes resembled a mildly chaotic workout routine. People formed circles or lines. They held hands. They stepped, hopped, spun, and occasionally bumped into each other in ways that made the clergy nervous. Medieval preachers complained that dancing led to sin, which was their default complaint about almost everything, including cakes. But dancing persisted, especially during feast days and weddings. One of the stranger medieval dances was the carol, where participants joined hands and moved in a large circle while singing. Imagine a group ring around the rosy that lasted for hours. Then there were farandals, serpentine line dances where a leader guided everyone through streets, fields, and occasionally into places the group definitely wasn't supposed to be. Dancing was communal joy. It was messy, loud, and very human, and it made medieval life just a bit brighter. A gentle drift into the world of puppet shows. Puppet shows existed throughout the Middle Ages, though medieval puppets looked less like friendly playthings and more like tiny wooden individuals who had seen unsettling things. Puppeteers traveled from town to town, performing stories about saints, morals, legends, and sometimes thinly veiled political satire that got them into trouble. Puppet shows drew both children and adults. Children giggled, adults chuckled politely, and the puppeteer tried to avoid being accused of heresy by someone whose sense of humor had tragically evaporated. But puppet shows served an important role. They brought storytelling to people who couldn't read. They turned myths into something lively and approachable, and they added a bit of theatrical whimsy to medieval streets that were otherwise filled with mud, livestock, and tax collectors. Now let's drift into the curious practice of hobby horses. A hobby horse, in the medieval sense, was not the simple stick with a head carving you might imagine today. Medieval hobby horses were elaborate costumes, often large enough for a grown man to climb into. Dancers wore them during festivals, prancing, neighing, and pretending to bite people. Imagine a parade where one participant, dressed as a theatrical wooden horse, wanders the crowd looking for someone to nibble gently on the arm. This was considered entertainment. Hobby horses appear in surviving festival descriptions all over Europe, and they seem to have been particularly popular during May Day celebrations, midsummer festivals, weddings, harvest parades. The meanings varied. Some said they symbolized fertility, others said they warded off evil. Many simply said, "It's tradition," which is the medieval equivalent of "I don't know, but we've always done it." Regardless of explanation, hobby horse dances brought laughter, music, and a sense of playful strangeness to medieval life. Drifting forward into medieval wrestling. Medieval wrestling wasn't quite like modern wrestling. There were no rings, no ropes, and certainly no elaborate stage names like the Duke of Bone Crushing. Instead, wrestling was a straightforward test of strength and technique. Almost every region had its own style. England had catch wrestling, Germany had ring-on, France had lutt, the Nordics had glimmer, which involved a lot of quietly determined gripping. Wrestling matches happened at fairs, festivals, and training grounds. Some kings even sponsored competitions, because nothing builds morale quite like watching two grown men try to flip each other into the dirt. Matches could be gentle or rough. Gentle matches were practice. Rough matches were the ones people actually watched. For peasants, wrestling was an accessible sport. No special equipment needed. Just a small patch of ground and enough confidence to think, "Yes, I want to see if I can lift this person." And whether you won or lost, the crowd reacted the same way. cheering, shouting, or offering unsolicited advice. Because crowds are timeless too. Let's softly wander into medieval ball games that made very little sense. We've talked about stool ball. We've talked about various chaotic games that involve balls, elbows, and occasional property damage. But there were more. So many more. Handball, the medieval version, players hit a ball with the palm of their hand against a wall. If this sounds familiar, yes, it still exists in various forms. Medieval monks loved handball, which led to several stern monastic rules like no shouting while playing, no boasting after scoring, no playing with excessive enthusiasm. Naturally, monks ignored most of these rules. La Salle or Schulsaal was a violent, energetic ball game played mostly in France and parts of England. Imagine a ball the size of a melon and two teams whose only goal was to get it to a certain point. The rules? No rules. Only chaos. Injuries guaranteed. Sometimes entire villages participated. Some games lasted for hours. Occasionally someone tried to set the ball on fire, because why not? Saul was eventually banned in multiple regions, usually after a match destroyed someone's barn. Gently wandering into medieval animal competitions, don't worry, we're not drifting into anything cruel here. Instead, let's explore the surprisingly wholesome side of medieval animal competitions. Sheep judging. Yes, medieval people held contests to determine who had the best sheep. People gathered. Experts examined wool, posture, and general sheep charisma. The winner earned prizes. The sheep earned nothing, because it was a sheep. Dog racing. Light, friendly, and absolutely beloved by children. Dogs chased lures or simply ran alongside their owners. No betting, no pressure, just joyful dogs being joyful. Horse beauty contests. Nobles proudly displayed their horses, showing off shiny coats, elegant posture, and the ability to trot in straight lines. Judges nodded thoughtfully, pretending this was the most important task of the day. These competitions added a gentle, almost pastoral warmth to medieval life. Ending part 5 with a soft drift toward medieval storytelling as we slow down, breathe, and ease toward the end of this section. We slip into one of the oldest and most comforting medieval pastimes, storytelling. People gathered around hearthfires. Minstrels traveled from town to town. Families sat together on dark winter evenings. Stories weren't just entertainment. They were memory. They were culture. They were the threads that tied communities together. Some were legends about heroes. Some were cautionary tales. Some were just funny stories about local characters doing mildly questionable things. And the act of listening to a story, quiet, communal, warm, remains one of the most timeless human experiences. It's a reminder that despite everything, despite the odd games, the dangerous sports, the strange festivals, medieval people were still people, looking for comfort, laughter, and a moment of escape from the world around them, much like we are now. So let's pause here. Let your breathing slow, let your thoughts settle, and we'll drift onward soon into yet another corner of medieval life, with the same soft humor and gentle calm. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle in, ease your shoulders, and let the day fall away like a slightly disappointing medieval tapestry left out in the rain. Tonight, we're drifting gently into yet another corner of the Middle Ages, one filled with wandering minstrels, court fools, troubadours, and assorted entertainers whose job, essentially, was to keep everyone distracted from the fact that life was cold, muddy, and full of questionable stew. So take a slow breath, and let's wander together into the soft candlelit world of medieval entertainment, where music soothed stressed nobles, and occasionally caused small diplomatic incidents, because of course it did. The Wandering Minstrel, a one-person medieval variety show. Let's start with the classic figure, the minstrel. If you're imagining a cheerful bard strolling from town to town with a lute, congratulations, you've absorbed about 3 centuries of romanticized artwork. Real minstrels were more like exhausted freelancers, drifting from job to job, carrying exactly one set of clothes, a half-tuned stringed instrument, and a lifetime of stories that may or may not have been stolen from someone else. They weren't considered noble artists. They weren't respected chroniclers of culture. They were, well, kind of like medieval gig workers. Most minstrels traveled in groups, partly for safety and partly because it made their performances marginally more impressive. A lone singer could easily be ignored, but show up with a partner who could juggle knives, while the third guy loudly hit a drum made from what used to be a goat, and suddenly the local lord might consider feeding you instead of kicking you out. Minstrels sang ballads, some heroic, some scandalous, and some so full of innuendo that monks had to pretend they didn't understand them. They repeated news from other towns, though accuracy was optional. If a story sounded dramatic enough, it was good enough. Medieval audiences weren't picky. They were cold, bored, and ready for whatever you brought. But minstrels lived with one constant problem. Nobles preferred their own private musicians, which brings us floating gently to the more refined members of the medieval entertainment world. Troubadours, the medieval soft voice of courtly love. Troubadours were minstrels' more sophisticated cousins, the artsy ones, the ones who wrote flowery poetry about longing from afar, and who would dramatically sigh at windowsills because their creative brand required suffering. They emerged in southern France, Provence, to be precise, where nobles had money, culture, and just enough free time to invent an entirely new form of emotional chaos: courtly love. Courtly love, in practice, was a complicated system of being hopelessly in love with someone you were absolutely not supposed to be involved with, usually the wife of your wealthy patron, which, naturally, led to poetic masterpieces and occasionally to duels, broken lutes, or awkward confrontations in hallways. Troubadours excelled at stirring noble hearts with highly poetic lines, such as, "My soul burns like a candle before your beauty. I perish at the mere thought of your distant glance," and sometimes loosely translated, "Please notice me, I am very sad." Troubadours represented the height of medieval romantic expression. They used complex rhyme structures. They composed in regional languages, like Occitan. They debated philosophical ideas of love, but even at their most sophisticated, they were still performers trying to maintain a steady paycheck. Some patrons adored them, others tolerated them. A few banned them entirely for causing too much emotional drama at court. One bishop famously forbade troubadours because their songs made people forget their duties, which is medieval speak for everyone was flirting instead of working. But before we drift too far into longing glances and emotionally fraught poetry, let's step sideways into something slightly more chaotic: the court fool. The only person allowed to tell the truth. One of the strangest and most paradoxical roles in medieval entertainment was the court fool. Officially, the fool's job was humor. Unofficially, he was the only one who could mock the king to his face and not immediately disappear into the moat. Kings liked fools for several reasons. Entertainment, obviously. Stress relief. Monarchs were chronically overwhelmed, often due to their own choices. A safe outlet for uncomfortable truths. "Sire, your tax policies are absurd," is easier to say when you're wearing jester bells. Some fools were brilliant, sharp-witted, perceptive, educated. Others were kept because of their eccentricities or disabilities, which today would be considered deeply unethical, but in the Middle Ages was considered a form of divine sign. The ethics of medieval Europe were famously invented on the back of a soggy napkin. The fool could get away with nearly anything. He could comment on politics. He could tease the queen. He could point out that the king's third attempt at growing a beard still made him look like a startled ferret. But fools had one major responsibility: keep the monarch entertained, because a bored king was a dangerous king. And a too honest fool could quickly find himself promoted to fool who used to work here still. There's something oddly wholesome about the medieval fool. In a world full of rigid hierarchy and quiet resentment, he alone moved freely through court, half entertainer, half emotional support human. Jugglers, acrobats, and people who did questionable things with fire. If you ever think modern talent shows are strange, medieval Europe had contestants who would fit perfectly on stage. Jugglers were popular across all classes. In a society where most people struggled to juggle basic survival, the sight of someone casually tossing knives into the air was considered borderline magical. Acrobats were equally admired. A person bending backward into a circle was just as impressive in 1250 as it is now, possibly more so, considering the average diet included 3 vegetables a year and a lot of bread shaped like bricks. Fire eaters and fire breathers were rare but unforgettable. Any performer who willingly put flames near their face immediately earned respect, fear, and, occasionally, light applause from people who were trying not to think about the accidental housefire potential. These entertainers often traveled with fairs and seasonal festivals. They performed in town squares, near markets, or anywhere people gathered to complain about taxes. Many lived hard lives. Performers weren't deeply trusted. Their nomadic lifestyle seemed suspicious. and anyone who appeared too skilled was occasionally accused of witchcraft, because in the medieval worldview, God might allow juggling, but juggling too well meant the devil was involved. Naturally, mystery plays, the original medieval theatre now. If you imagine entertainment in the Middle Ages and think theatre, you might picture grand stages, heavy curtains, dramatic lighting, and you would be wrong in the most adorable way. Medieval theatre grew out of church rituals, literally inside churches. Priests acted out biblical scenes during major holidays to help congregations understand sacred stories, but the concept grew and expanded, and then escaped into the streets. Mystery plays became enormous community productions performed by craft guilds. The carpenters acted out Noah's Ark. The bakers performed the Last Supper. The butchers, naturally, ended up performing the scenes involving martyrs, because of course they did. These plays were creative, chaotic, and surprisingly funny. Medieval Europeans loved adding humor, even to scenes that were supposed to be very serious. There were donkey costumes, drunken prophets, angels on ropes being lowered too fast, and occasionally props that broke at extremely inconvenient moments. Some cycles of plays lasted all day, some lasted multiple days. One famously lasted 48 hours, which feels less like religious instruction and more like theatrical hostage-taking. But mystery plays brought communities together. They were free, they were lively. They were the closest thing the Middle Ages had to Netflix. The troubling case of the dancing mania now. Drifting gently as always, let's touch on a phenomenon that is technically entertainment adjacent. In the same way a thunderstorm is water adjacent, dancing mania. From the 14th to 17th centuries, groups of people across Europe would suddenly begin dancing uncontrollably, hours, sometimes days, until they collapsed. No one is entirely sure what caused it: mass hysteria, ergot poisoning, or perhaps the medieval equivalent of a group chat gone horribly wrong. Musicians were sometimes hired to play them out, which is exactly as ineffective as it sounds. In one recorded incident, the presence of musicians caused more people to join the uncontrollable dancing, which is honestly the most medieval outcome possible. Imagine being a musician summoned to help and ending up accidentally expanding the problem. That must have been an awkward conversation when the local authorities asked how things went. Well, they're still dancing, and there are now 30 more of them. Beautiful. Animal entertainers, bears, dogs, and creatures who wanted none of this animal performances were also popular. Unfortunately for the animals, medieval entertainment ethics were non-existent. Bear baiting was common. So were trained bears that danced, or dogs that performed tricks, or monkeys that wore tiny outfits and did routines that were half adorable, half unsettling. People loved it. Animals tolerated it. No one involved was making great life choices. One famous 13th century performing bear reportedly escaped in Paris and ran through the streets while its handler yelled apologies behind it. Some citizens found this terrifying. Others considered it the best entertainment they'd had in weeks. Again, deeply medieval energy. Musicians at court, when your job is to pretend the king can sing inside noble courts. Professional musicians had a slightly more stable life than wandering minstrels. They had salaries, food, and the privilege of listening to nobles attempt music. Kings and queens loved music. They also loved participating. Skill was optional. One chronicler gently noted that a certain duke sang with enthusiasm unmatched by talent, which is medieval historian code for everyone covered their ears and prayed for mercy. Court musicians composed dances, love songs, and instrumental pieces. They accompanied feasts. They played between courses. They performed on command. Their status varied across Europe. In some courts, they were respected. In others, they were treated as servants with instruments. But in all courts, musicians were expected to maintain a delicate balance, entertain without overshadowing the nobility. If a musician played too well, they risked jealousy. If they played too poorly, they risked being replaced. It was a tightrope of sound and survival. Storytellers and folk narrators, the human libraries. Finally, we drift toward one of my favorite types of medieval entertainers, the storytellers. These were the keepers of oral tradition. They remembered genealogies, local legends, heroic sagas, ghost stories, and tales of kings who behaved badly, which, to be fair, was most kings. Storytellers performed in taverns, at village gatherings, or beside winter fires. Their tales could stretch for hours. Some stories lasted so long that storytellers inserted built-in breaks for sleep and food. Storytellers didn't need instruments or props. Their tool was the human voice, steady, rhythmic, low, much like the voice you're listening to right now. Their audiences were peasants, merchants, travelers, and occasionally nobles who wandered in because they preferred stories told with some actual emotional depth. Storytellers shaped cultural memory. They kept history alive, or at least a lavish accuracy sometimes drifted over generations, but the atmosphere never did. As we drift toward the next topic, medieval entertainment wasn't glamorous, it wasn't polished, but it was deeply human. People danced, they sang, they told stories, they juggled things they shouldn't have been juggling. They tried, in their own chaotic way, to make life lighter. And now, as your breathing slows and the candle of tonight's history gently flickers down, let's drift over, in the next part, to something slightly more chaotic, slightly more muddy, and always full of questionable decisions. Hey everyone, welcome back. Take a moment to settle deeper into your pillow, adjust your blanket, and let your breathing fall into that soft, even rhythm that the ancient world never quite managed to achieve. Tonight, we re-drifting back to one of history's most lingering mysteries, the final days of Alexander the Great. Yes, the man who conquered empires before most people today finished graduate school, who marched across continents like he misplaced something, who built cities in his own name because subtlety wasn't one of his strengths, and yet, at the end, he slipped away quietly in a hot, restless June of 323 BCE, in a palace in Babylon, surrounded by worried generals and an atmosphere best described as extremely tense, with hints of future civil war. So let your eyes get heavy, let your thoughts soften, and let's drift into those last 2 weeks of Alexander's life, where ambition met exhaustion, and the world's most famous conqueror found himself undone by something he could neither bribe nor intimidate. The setting: Babylon, a city too large and too loud. When Alexander entered Babylon fresh off a decade of non-stop conquering, he was only 32 but already had the health profile of a man whose lifestyle choices included heatstroke, constant marching, heavy drinking, and personally participating in battles because apparently delegation was for lesser mortals. Babylon greeted him with celebrations, parades, official ceremonies, and probably several thousand people loudly proclaiming their eternal loyalty. It was impressive, yes, but not exactly restful. Alexander planned new campaigns, because why pause after conquering half the known world when you can conquer the other half? He wanted to invade Arabia next, perhaps circumnavigate Africa, and maybe, just maybe, find the edge of the world. His generals, meanwhile, wanted to lie down somewhere cool and never move again. But Babylon was humid, buzzing with insects, full of political tension, and home to more omens than anyone strictly needed. Priests reported worrying signs, animals behaved strangely, and at least one astrologer advised Alexander not to enter the city at all. Alexander waved this off with the confidence of a man who considered himself invincible, which historically is always a sign things are about to go wrong. The final banquet, where everything begins to tilt Alexander's last days, began, rather anticlimactically, at a banquet. This was not unusual. He loved banquets, he loved speeches, he loved drinking competitions he absolutely should not have participated in. The traditional story says he attended a long evening feast at the house of his friend Mead. There was singing, drinking, laughter, and that peculiar kind of cheerful exhaustion that comes from a decade of conquering several million square miles of territory. Alexander drank heavily, far more than his already impressive average. Some sources claim he consumed a large bowl of unmixed wine in one go, which, for reference, is an excellent way to impress absolutely no one while severely stressing your internal organs. At some point that night, he felt a sudden, sharp pain. Different writers describe it in different ways: a stabbing sensation in his side, a deep ache spreading through his abdomen, a fever that rose fast and didn't let go. He reportedly said, "I feel a great pain after drinking," which is history's calmest understatement. Was it poison? Was it illness? Was it just Alexander finally reaching the limit of what a human body can tolerate? We'll never know. And Alexander, unfortunately, was too busy becoming extremely ill to clarify. The fever, a slow, steady decline for the next several days. Alexander weakened, his fever climbed. He struggled to speak, he lost strength in his limbs. The medical team trained in all the finest methods of the 4th century BCE, like warm compresses and hopeful guessing, did what they could. Alexander continued issuing commands at first. He discussed troop movements. He gave orders for the Arabian expedition. He insisted he would recover, but his voice grew faint, his body weakened, and the palace fell into a quiet panic. His generals gathered in the hallways like anxious cats around an empty food bowl. Some cried, some stared, some quietly calculated how many soldiers they could convince to follow them once Alexander inevitably slipped away. After 2 exhausting weeks of fever, his condition collapsed. He could no longer move. He could barely speak, but his mind tragically seemed to have stayed clear. One of the last things he was able to do was let his soldiers see him. The final farewell. A conqueror silently watched when it became clear he was dying. His generals allowed Alexander's troops to pass by him, one by one, despite the risk of infection. Thousands entered the room. The world's greatest conqueror, unable to speak, raised his hand weakly in recognition as each soldier passed. Some scholars say this moment proves he died of illness, not poison, simply because the timeline is too long, too slow. Poison tends to be more dramatic, sudden, violent. Alexander's death was a steady decline, like a lamp burning through its last oil, but his silence spoke louder than any words. He couldn't reassure them, he couldn't rally them, he could only acknowledge them, quietly, as the empire he built edged toward chaos. After the final soldier passed, Alexander slipped into unconsciousness. Within a short time, he was gone, 32 years old, unconquered by any army, defeated, maybe, by fever, exhaustion, alcohol, or malaria, depending which scholar you ask. The question everyone asked: who inherits all this? Alexander's empire was vast. Greece, Persia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, parts of India, and all of it was suddenly without a ruler, a terrifying amount of land, and no clear successor. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant. His half-brother, Aridaeus, had cognitive impairments, and his generals disliked one another intensely. When asked who should rule, Alexander supposedly whispered, "To the strongest," which is the kind of answer that is absolutely magnificent for inspiring centuries of dramatic storytelling, and absolutely catastrophic for actual political stability. In reality, he likely said something more practical, like gesturing toward his generals or mumbling something unclear. But ancient historians, much like modern YouTubers, loved dramatic quotes. And so the empire descended into the wars of the successors, a multi-decade family spat conducted with elephants and siege engines. But before the wars broke out, there was the small detail of Alexander's body, the corpse that refused to decompose, an ancient mystery. After his death, something strange happened. According to several ancient accounts, Alexander's body did not begin to decompose for several days. No odor, no discoloration, no visible decay. To the Macedonians, this was a sign of divinity. To modern scholars, it's a sign he may not have been dead yet, just deeply, catastrophically unconscious. To his well, it was probably a very awkward couple of days. The priests and physicians declared it a miracle. They prepared the body slowly, carefully, as if handling something between a god and a diplomatic crisis. And then the next question arose: where do you bury someone like Alexander? The body napping of Alexander the Great. The official plan was to return his body to Macedonia, to be buried with his ancestors. This was reasonable, traditional, dignified, but Ptolemy, one of his generals, had other ideas. Ptolemy knew that possessing Alexander's body meant possessing his symbolic power. So during the funeral procession, while the golden hearse rolled slowly through the empire, Ptolemy intercepted it and stole the entire thing. He rerouted the body to Egypt, where he installed it in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. He hosted ceremonies, he built shrines, he made sure everyone associated Alexander with him, and it worked. Ptolemy became pharaoh. His descendants ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, and Alexander's tomb became a famous pilgrimage site, until it mysteriously disappeared sometime in late antiquity. Even in death, Alexander generated drama. Of course he did. So what actually killed him? People have debated this for over 2,000 years. Let's gently drift through the possibilities. 1. Fever, illness, likely malaria, typhoid, or West Nile virus. Babylon was mosquito heaven. Alexander had wounds, exhaustion, and weakened immunity. 2. Alcohol poisoning. He drank heavily at that last banquet, despite being unwell. A sudden sharp pain followed by fever fits some poisoning by alcohol patterns. 3. Existing injuries catching up to him. He had been shot, stabbed, slashed, concussed, nearly drowned, and partially frozen multiple times. The man treated shrapnel removal as a hobby. 4. Poison. It's dramatic, but unlikely. Ancient poisons were fast, not slow burn 13-day fevers, but political motives certainly existed. 5. Autoimmune or pancreatic failure. Rare, but proposed by some medical historians. In the end, the simplest explanation remains the most plausible. He worked his body past the breaking point for a decade straight, and Babylon's climate delivered the final blow. Even world conquerors cannot outmarch mortality. Drifting toward the next part, Alexander's death marked the end of an era, and the beginning of one of history's longest and messiest succession crises. His generals carved up his empire like sleep-deprived toddlers dividing desert. His descendants struggled to survive. His legend expanded until it barely resembled the man himself. But his final days, quiet, feverish, strangely human, pull him back down from myth and let us see him for what he truly was. A brilliant, flawed, exhausted young man who lived too fast, burned too bright, and left the world scrambling in his absence. Take a slow breath. Let the story settle. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle your shoulders, loosen your jaw a little. Maybe let out that quiet sigh you've been holding since the last part. Tonight, we re-drifting into the strangely soothing chaos that followed Alexander's death. An era historians politely call the Wars of the Diadochi, and less polite commentators might call a decades-long temper tantrum conducted by highly armed adults who absolutely refused to share. Think of it as a celestial version of a family inheritance dispute, except the inheritance was half the known world, and the family was a group of generals, each convinced they'd been Alexander's favorite, even if the evidence for that was occasionally thin. So let your mind rest. We're floating into an age of shifting alliances, dusty battlefields, and gently simmering resentment. Nothing dramatic, nothing sharp, just a long, steady unraveling of the empire. Alexander never lived long enough to organize. When Alexander died, everyone panicked, quietly. Of course, the moment Alexander stopped breathing, the palace atmosphere changed. His generals, all hardened warriors who had lived through every campaign, suddenly realized they were standing on a political earthquake. There was no adult heir, no clear plan, no documented final wishes. In modern terms, Alexander essentially turned off his computer without saving his empire file. His half-brother Iridius was alive, but suffered from cognitive impairments. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, and no general wanted to admit that they themselves had ambitions, because openly saying, "Actually, I would like to rule everything," was considered impolite, even by Macedonian standards. So they convened a meeting, a calm, reasoned discussion, which, naturally, immediately devolved into shouting. Perdiccas becomes regent because someone had to look responsible. The generals finally settled on a compromise best described as a disaster waiting to happen. They would rule collectively, with a regent overseeing things until a legitimate heir appeared. The regent chosen was Perdiccas, Alexander's loyal and extremely ambitious second-in-command. Perdiccas announced the empire would remain unified. A noble idea, a lovely dream, utterly doomed. Within weeks, the others began quietly taking regions for themselves. Ptolemy eyed Egypt the way a cat eyes an unattended chicken. Seleucus maneuvered for Persia and Mesopotamia. Lysimachus took Thrace as a sort of consolation prize. Antigonus, the one-eyed man, built from equal parts battlefield experience and sheer stubbornness, claimed parts of Asia Minor. The empire was suddenly a patchwork of possessive generals, all pretending to support unity while quietly fortifying borders. Perdiccas looked around and realized he was essentially babysitting 6 toddlers with war elephants. The body of Alexander still causing problems while all this political juggling took place. Alexander's body was being prepared for transport to Macedonia. Formal, dignified, very traditional. Ptolemy, however, had other ideas. He intercepted the funeral procession and stole the entire royal corpse. It was the ancient world's most dramatic act of body snatching, and everyone was too shocked to respond for several seconds. By taking Alexander's body to Egypt, Ptolemy made a statement: "If you want legitimacy, you must come through me." Perdiccas took this extremely personally, so personally that he immediately launched a military campaign against Ptolemy. This would have gone better had Perdiccas not attempted a disastrous river crossing of the Nile. where many of his troops drowned in the mud. His soldiers, fed up with his leadership, gently removed him from command by removing him from existence, and so ended the brief era of regency. The empire splinters like a ceramic vase dropped downstairs with Perdiccas gone. The generals held another meeting, another attempt at unity, another round of polite chaos. They redistributed territories again, because why not? Roxana gave birth to Alexander IV, the infant heir, and was officially declared Queen Mother. Aridus remained coking, though mostly in name, and for a brief moment, brief enough to blink and miss, things seemed settled. Until Antigonus the One-Eyed decided he was feeling ambitious. Antigonus the One-Eyed decides he'd like the entire empire. Please, Antigonus was a veteran commander, tough, seasoned, and famous for losing one eye in battle, that especially heroic brand of injury that turns you into a legend whether you like it or not. He began consolidating Asia Minor, then Syria, then parts of the eastern territories. His power grew so quickly that the other generals suddenly realized they might have accidentally allowed a new Alexander to form. They responded with a rare moment of agreement. We should stop him. Thus began the First War of the Successors, in which all the surviving generals formed a coalition against Antigonus. Because if the ancient world loved anything, it was dramatic alliances made entirely out of mutual fear. Ptolemy, the surprisingly calm one throughout these conflicts, Ptolemy in Egypt, remained oddly stable. While others fought, he built fortresses, reformed administration, placated the local priests, and quietly collected nice things for Alexandria. He also kept Alexander's body somewhere secure, a kind of geopolitical bargaining chip, and a tourist attraction. Ptolemy was the rare figure in this story who seemed to understand that ruling an empire required more than shouting and hoping. He gave himself the title Savior after defeating an invading army, and, impressively, the locals just accepted it. Compared to the chaos elsewhere, Egypt became the calm center of a very turbulent world. The wars continue. Everyone changes sides constantly. The Diadochi Wars were long and uncomfortable, and full of moments where generals switched allegiances faster than most people change blankets on a cold night. One year Seleucus supported Ptolemy. The next year he supported Antigonus. Then he switched back, then betrayed someone, then betrayed the betrayal. It was all very fluid, like a political soap opera, but with more elephants. The only consistent trend was that each general slowly carved out his own territory. Ptolemy kept Egypt. Seleucus built an enormous eastern empire stretching to India. Lysimachus ruled Thrace and parts of Anatolia. Cassander controlled Macedonia and Greece, and may have quietly arranged the deaths of Alexander's surviving family members, though ancient sources were unsure whether to blame Cassander or just the general atmosphere of paranoia. And Antigonus, he became the main threat to all of them. The Battle of Ipsus, the gentle end of Antigonus's big plans in 301 BCE. The remaining generals teamed up one last time, mostly out of habit at this point, to stop Antigonus from becoming too powerful. The Battle of Ipsus was massive. Tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of elephants, cavalry charges, shields glinting under an enormous Anatolian sky. But don't worry, you're not here for adrenaline. You're here for the soft, drifting sense of history sliding gently past. So imagine the distant sound of hooves, the slow rhythmic march of infantry, the calm inevitability of fate. Antigonus, nearly 80 years old and ancient by ancient standards, fought bravely, but in the end, he fell. His dream of reunifying the empire ended with him. His son, Demetrius, escaped, beginning yet another chapter of wandering ambition. But for now, the major conflict settled into a quiet, restless equilibrium. The empire that became several empires after Ipsus, the Diadochi, finally accepted reality. Alexander's empire wasn't going back together. Not now, not ever. Instead, it settled into three major kingdoms. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy, ruled for nearly 300 years, ended with Cleopatra VII. The Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus, huge, diverse, always slightly overextended. The Antigonid kingdom in Macedon, descendants of eventually overshadowed by Rome. These kingdoms would become the backbone of the Hellenistic Aegean era of philosophy, science, art, and cultural blending. In a way, their constant fighting accidentally created one of history's most innovative periods, a strange silver lining, forged through exhaustion and stubbornness. The tragic fate of Alexander's family as the generals carved out kingdoms, the last traces of Alexander's direct bloodline began to fade. Roxana and the infant Alexander IV were initially protected, but political usefulness has an expiration date. Cassandra, an ambitious, sharp-edged Macedonian noble, eventually had both of them quietly killed, likely by poisoning. No public trial, no spectacle, just removal. Iridius, Alexander's half-brother, was murdered earlier, caught between rival factions. By the early 3rd century BCE, not a single member of Alexander's immediate family remained alive. His legacy lived on, his cities thrived, his legend grew. But his dynasty flickered out almost the moment it began. It's a quiet, somber ending, one the ancient storytellers rarely emphasized, but one that settles softly into the mind. Even the greatest empires can disappear like morning mist. Seleucus, the last great survivor amid the shifting tides, one man outlasted his peers. Seleucus, he lived through nearly every conflict. He built alliances, betrayed some, prepared others, marched armies across deserts, made deals with Indian kings, founded cities, then founded more. At the end of his life, he attempted to take Macedonia itself, perhaps imagining himself the final heir of Alexander's dream, but fate intervened. He was assassinated by a rival, gently, efficiently, with the quiet inevitability that defined the entire Diadochi era. And with that, the age of Alexander's generals ended, a quiet afterglow. What remained of Alexander's world? When we step back, there's something oddly calm about the aftermath. Yes, the wars were loud and long, but the world that emerged was richer in culture, ideas, and art. Greek influence blended with Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, and Indian traditions. New cities flourished, trade boomed, philosophers wrote, scientists experimented. The seeds of future civilizations took root. Alexander had wanted unity. He got fragmentation. But the fragmentation created something unexpectedly beautiful, a mosaic of kingdoms, linked by language, connected by trade, shaped by ambition and memory. The empire fractured, but the world grew. As we drift toward Part 9, take a slow breath. Let the rise and fall of these ancient figures settle like dust on a sunlit marble floor. The wars of the successors were chaotic, yes, but in their chaos, they revealed something universal. Ambition ends, borders shift, but stories remain, drifting softly across centuries. Hey everyone, let's settle back in. If your pillow has shifted a little, feel free to nudge it into place. And if your blanket has somehow migrated to the cold, unreachable abyss at the foot of the bedwell, that's just tradition at this point. Tonight, we continue floating through the dim, fevered corridors of Babylon in 323 BCE, where Alexander the Great, conqueror of Persia, self-declared son of Zeus, breaker of cities, collector of regions, and occasional wearer of worryingly dramatic cloaks, is drifting gently toward the end of his very mortal life. We left him in Part 8, slowly losing his speech, surrounded by a room full of anxious generals who kept pretending everything was completely fine. Because nothing says healthy leadership transition like refusing to acknowledge the giant critical problem standing lying right in front of you. So let's slip back inside that room. It's warm, the air barely moves, there's sweat on everyone's forehead, but not a drop of certainty anywhere, and Alexander is fading. The final day, when silence spoke louder than any oracle. By the last day of his life, Alexander could no longer talk, not even a whisper. Not even one of those faint exhalations you do when you trying to say something but give up halfway because it feels like too much work. The fever had overtaken everything: his mind, his coordination, his ability to stand. Even his always enthusiastic ego seemed to have curled up for a nap. And with his silence came panic. Not loudly, not theatrically, just a steady bloom of dread that spread across the palace like mold creeping along a forgotten loaf of ancient wheat bread. The generals tried not to look at each other. They tried not to say anything alarming. They tried, most of all, not to admit that the man who had conquered half the known world before turning 33 was probably about to die from something profoundly undramatic, a fever, or poisoning, or a mix of extremely enthusiastic binge drinking and exhaustion, or malaria or typhoid. Historians are still arguing about it like a group of owls who've had too much coffee. But in that moment, no one cared about the cause. They cared about the consequences. Alexander had no clear heir, he had no plan, and a leaderless empire is basically a piñata dangling in the middle of a group of very competitive children. The army visits the dying king. One of the last acts Alexander performed, if we can call it, that was allowing his soldiers to file past him. The rank and file, the ones who had marched with him from Macedon through Persia and down toward India. They loved him, and feared him, and resented him, and worshipped him. It was a complicated relationship, the kind usually reserved for deities and charismatic cult leaders. They entered the room in waves. Some cried, some saluted, some whispered their loyalty, some stared in disbelief, as if the sheer force of their confusion might somehow reverse the process of death itself. And Alexander simply blinked at them, one slow eyelid, then the other. That was all he could manage. But the soldiers took it as a blessing, or a farewell, or, for a few hopeful ones, a sign that he would spring back up tomorrow and drag them all somewhere new, probably across another desert. It was the last time many of them saw him alive. The prophecy that made things worse, because of course it did. Babylon had its fair share of omens, birds, thunderstorms, goats doing suspiciously symbolic things. But the one everyone remembered was the priest from the temple of Marduk, who muttered, unhelpfully, "It is not good for the king to enter the city," which was a bit late as far as warnings go. Alexander had ignored it, naturally. This was a man who once sliced a knot in half, instead of untying it. He didn't specialize in caution. But now, as his fever raged, everyone suddenly remembered the prophecy and decided it was extremely relevant. They whispered it in corners. They repeated it as if it were a diagnosis. They muttered that maybe the gods had finally decided he was doing too much. And, honestly, they weren't wrong. Alexander played life like it was a speed run. The prophecy didn't make anyone feel better, but it gave them something dramatic to blame, always a popular option in antiquity. The moment everything went still, there is no grand description of Alexander's final breath, no thunder cracking across the sky, no celestial sign that a world-changing life had come to an end. Instead, it seems things simply paused. His breathing slowed. People leaned in, they waited, and then it stopped, quietly, softly, like a flame at the end of a wick, just sputtering out. June 323 BCE, Alexander the Great was gone. And in that instant, the most powerful empire in the world became a very expensive object without clear ownership. The immediate panic, subtle as a herd of elephants, the moment Alexander died, the room erupted, not visibly at first, but emotionally, which is, arguably, worse. Men who had followed him across continents suddenly realized they had no idea what to do next. Perdiccas tried to look authoritative, which he always did when confused. Ptolemy started calculating opportunities the way accountants calculate tax loopholes. Antipater, back in Macedon, was probably already telling everyone, "I told you this would happen," whether or not he actually had. The problem was simple. Alexander had left. No adult son, no designated heir, no succession plan, and no handy instruction manual for how to operate an empire. His half-brother, Eridaeus, was mentally unfit for rule. His unborn child with Roxana was quite literally unborn. So the generals immediately did what powerful people do when thrown into uncertainty. They started arguing, loudly, passionately, destructively. Some said the empire should be united under one regent. Others wanted everything divided, like a cake at a very unfriendly birthday party. Some wanted Roxana's baby to be king. Some wanted Eridaeus. Others wanted neither. It was chaos, with a vaguely administrative flavor. The corpse problem. You would think a dead king would be a unifying force, but Alexander's corpse became its own political weapon. He needed a royal funeral, something spectacular, something that would convince the world that he was less dead man and more temporary inconvenience. But first, he needed to be embalmed, which the Egyptians insisted they were very, very good at. Too good, actually. Suspiciously good. When the embalmers finally prepared the body, people noticed something strange. The corpse didn't decay at all. For days, weeks, according to some reports, which was unusual, unless you were divine, or preserved with an extremely enthusiastic amount of resin, oils, and fragrant optimism. Some took it as a sign Alexander had become a god. Others suspected it was simply the skill of Egyptian morticians. But in either case, the body became a point of contention. Ptolemy wanted it, Perdiccas wanted it, Macedon wanted it, Egypt wanted it. Everyone wanted the king's body, because possessing it meant legitimacy. Imagine a tug-of-war over a coffin. That was basically the next 2 years. Because nothing in Alexander's legacy could ever be straightforward. Roxana, alone in a palace full of ambition while the generals fought. Roxana, Alexander's wife, faced her own crisis. She was pregnant, she was isolated, and she was surrounded by men who considered her both essential and inconvenient, a brilliant combination. She understood something very clearly. A world without Alexander was a world where her child was either heir or obstacle. So she did what many royal women did in fragile succession moments. She eliminated potential rivals, specifically Steta, Alexander's other wife, and her sister, quietly, efficiently, with the kind of calm decisiveness that tends to unsettle powerful men. Whether Alexander would have approved is irrelevant. He wasn't there, and Roxana intended to survive. The empire cracks open like an overripe fig with the body preserved, but the succession unpreserved. The empire slid towards civil war. Perdiccas tried to hold everything together, which went about as well as you'd expect from someone whose leadership style could be described as aggressively indecisive. Ptolemy stole Alexander's body and hauled it to Egypt. A very bold move. He basically kidnapped a corpse, but a famous corpse, so it felt classy. Antigonus started acting like the empire was already his. Cassander plotted quietly. Lysimachus lurked in the background, waiting for his moment, like a cat who hasn't decided which snack to pounce on. In other words, the minute Alexander stopped breathing, the empire began breathing fire. The next decades would be filled with battles, betrayals, shifting alliances, and enough drama to fuel several seasons of prestige television. But what happens when the world's greatest conqueror forgets to leave behind a memo? The legend begins the moment the life ends. Oddly enough, Alexander's death is when his legend really started growing. Stories bloomed like wildflowers. He was poisoned by jealous generals. He was murdered by Antipater's sons. He died because he angered the gods. He drank too much wine and forgot he was mortal. He died of a disease nobody could name. He secretly ascended to Olympus, because of course he did. Each culture chose its own story. Each one shaped him into exactly what they needed him to be. A hero, a tyrant, a prophet, a warning, a symbol. And perhaps that's fitting. Alexander lived fast. He conquered loudly. But he died quietly and left the world to argue about him forever. Drifting toward the next part, the room in Babylon slowly empties. The generals slip away to plot. The soldiers retreat to whisper. The palace settles into uneasy silence, and Alexander, silent in ways he never was in life, lies at the center of an empire about to tear itself apart. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've shifted positions a dozen times trying to find that one magical angle where your spine, pillow, and sanity all agreed, don't worry. You're not alone, and you're in excellent historical company. Most of Alexander's generals spent the next 40 years doing roughly the same thing, minus the mattress and plus several catastrophic wars. Tonight, we read drifting into the strangely sleepy chaos that followed Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, a time when nearly every ambitious man in the empire attempted to play who gets the world. Spoiler, no one won, not even slightly. So let's settle back and float calmly through the wars, betrayals, baby kings, suspicious regents, and the sort of political compromises that only happen when everyone involved is deeply stubborn and mildly terrified. Take a breath, let your jaw relax, and follow me quietly into the ruins of Alexander's impossible empire. A gathering of generals who all thought they should be in charge right after Alexander died. His top commanders gathered in Babylon to figure out the state of, well, everything. Perdiccas took charge of the meeting because he happened to be holding Alexander's signet ring at the time, not because Alexander had said anything like, "You're in charge now." No, the ring was basically handed to him by a panicked attendant who didn't want the responsibility. And Perdiccas interpreted this as "the gods have chosen me." Ambition makes people read very creatively. The generals immediately split into two camps. Camp 1, the unity group led by Perdiccas. They insisted the empire should remain whole, because Alexander would have wanted it that way, or at least they said he would, which is often just as effective. Their plan was, crown Aristeus, Alexander's half-brother with cognitive impairments, crown Alexander's unborn son once he was born, rule as regents in the meantime. Pretend this wasn't going to backfire. Spectacularly. Camp 2, the let's just divide everything group led by basically everyone else, Antigonus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and others who were already dreaming of kingdoms they absolutely had not earned but desperately wanted. They liked Alexander, sure, but they liked ruling territories more. The debate went on for hours, possibly days. History is unclear, but given the personalities involved, we can assume the tone was something like, "I should rule this region because Alexander loved me most. No, he loved me most. No, he absolutely hated both of you." Eventually, they settled on a plan that satisfied exactly no one. Aridius would be king. Roxana's baby, assuming it was a boy, would be joint king. Perdiccas would serve as regent, and the generals would cooperate peacefully. The last part was adorable. Perdiccas starts acting like a substitute Alexander. With the plan set, Perdiccas immediately decided that he was basically king in everything except name. He issued commands. He reorganized territories. He started telling other ambitious generals what to do, and they reacted exactly as you would expect, by ignoring him aggressively. The first major defector was Ptolemy, stationed in Egypt, who took one look at Perdiccas' aggressive centralization and said, "No thank you. I will be starting my own empire now." He also stole Alexander's body, an act of political symbolism, so dramatic that somewhere, even Alexander's ghost probably sighed and rolled its spectral eyes. Perdiccas was furious, not because he cared about funerary traditions, but because Ptolemy's theft made him look weak, and the one thing you never want to be, when your job title is regent of a giant and unstable empire, is weak. The baby king who inherited half the world and none of the power in 323 BCE, Roxana gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, a baby who immediately became one of the most important people in the world, and also one of the most doomed to the Macedonian army. Having a legitimate heir was comforting. To everyone else, it was inconvenient. A baby king meant no adult could call himself king, which meant the generals couldn't fully claim territories as independent states, which meant the empire wasn't ready to dissolve, and most of the generals really wanted it to dissolve. So Roxana's infant son became a breathing obstacle, a cute obstacle, probably, but an obstacle nonetheless. Roxana did her best. She guarded him. She aligned herself with She trusted that loyalty and legitimacy would protect them. Unfortunately, this is the ancient world. Loyalty was something people talked about reverently, while betraying each other in increasingly creative ways. Perdiccas' brilliant plan, also known as how to make everyone hate you, around 321 BCE. Perdiccas made two excellent decisions. He tried to marry Cleopatra, Alexander's full sister, an act that would make him effectively royal. Everyone else found this deeply threatening. He attempted to invade Egypt to punish Ptolemy, despite the fact that Ptolemy was smarter, calmer, and significantly better at not self-destructing. The Egyptian campaign was a masterpiece of bad judgment. Perdiccas marched his army into blazing heat. His supplies failed. His strategy failed. His troops became dehydrated, demoralized, and confused. And at the crucial river crossing, dozens of soldiers drowned. At this point, the army had seen enough. They killed Perdiccas in his tent, politely, efficiently, almost gratefully. His reign as regent ended approximately the way everyone expected it to. Ptolemy, the man who quietly won by not being idiotic. While Perdiccas was imploding, Ptolemy was thriving. He didn't scream, he didn't rant, he didn't try to claim the entire empire. He built up Egypt slowly and peacefully, like someone cultivating a nice garden while the rest of the neighborhood burned enthusiastically. He installed stability, he restored temples, he balanced the books. He even treated Alexander's stolen corpse with respectful ceremony. This made people trust him, or at least not immediately plot to kill him. Small victories matter. Over the next decades, Ptolemy became one of the only successor rulers who died peacefully in bed, which says a lot about the benefits of not behaving like a chaos gremlin. The empire divides again, and again, and again. After Perdiccas' death, the generals gathered again to divide the empire. This time, the negotiations were slightly calmer, mostly because everyone was tired, and also because the memory of the last meeting still gave them collective migraines. The new distribution looked something like this. Antipater became regent of the whole empire. Antigonus gained authority over much of Asia Minor. Seleucus got Babylon. Ptolemy kept Egypt. Lysimachus took Thrace. Cassander started plotting from Macedon. It looked stable on paper, which should have been a warning in itself. Within a year, the alliances had shifted again, then again, then again, then again. Honestly, the political map of Alexander's former empire changed so often, it resembled a toddler's finger painting lots of color. Little logic, and a constant sense of sticky chaos. Seleucus, the man who accidentally built a massive empire. Seleucus, who spent the first years post-Alexander politely keeping his head down, eventually built the largest of the successor kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire. He did this by not annoying the army, not attempting wildly inappropriate marriages, not trying to conquer Egypt during a heatwave, and generally behaving like a reasonable person, which, in the successor era, was the political equivalent of sorcery. His empire stretched from the Mediterranean into Persia and parts of India, territory so vast that even Alexander would have raised an eyebrow in respect. Seleucus didn't have an easy life. There were betrayals, assassinations, wars, but compared to the average successor, he was practically serene. That's the reward you get for not being aggressively foolish. Antigonus and Demetrius, father and son, chaos mode. If the successors were a cast of eccentric uncles at a very unstable family gathering, Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, was the extremely loud one at the end of the table, loudly insisting that the empire belonged to him. Antigonus wanted everything: Asia, Greece, the title of king, the legacy of Alexander, probably the decorative pottery in Babylon too. And he dragged his son Demetrius into this ambition. Demetrius was charismatic, very good at siege warfare, very bad at long-term planning, prone to dramatic gestures, and unable to sit still for more than 10 minutes. The combination of father and son created a storm of near-constant warfare. At one point, they were winning, then losing, then winning again, then losing again. Eventually, the other successors looked at each other and said, "We should probably team up and deal with them before they take everything," which is exactly what happened. At the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, Antigonus was killed, Demetrius escaped, and the empire fractured again, this time permanently. The tragic end of Alexander's dynasty. Alexander's biological line did not fare well. Aridius Philip III, Alexander's half-brother and co-king, was manipulated by generals, used as a puppet, and eventually murdered around 317 BCE by Olympias, Alexander's mother, because she wanted control for her grandson. Roxana and Alexander IV were briefly protected, then quietly imprisoned, then forgotten during the ongoing wars, and eventually murdered by Cassander around 310 BCE. They were buried in secret. No funeral, no honor, just a quiet erasure. Cassander then declared himself king of Macedon, presumably telling himself that eliminating a child made him very responsible and king-like. The Argead dynasty, the ancient Macedonian royal house, ended with a whisper. Alexander's line was gone. His blood vanished. His empire shattered. It was a remarkably fast collapse for a realm won at such extraordinary cost, and yet something of him lingered. Even though his dynasty fell, Alexander himself remained as present as ever. His name echoed through the territories. His strategies shaped armies for centuries. His cities survived long after the successors died. His legend grew instead of shrinking. People argued about him, admired him, condemned him, romanticized him, turned him into myth, claimed him as their own. Egypt said he was theirs. Persia said he was theirs. Greece said he was theirs. Rome practically built an entire masculinity complex around him. And yet Alexander himself, silent now, gone, unreachable, had probably never imagined any of this. He lived fast. He died fast. And the world spent centuries trying to understand how someone so brilliant and so reckless could burn so brightly across so much land in so little time. A slow drift toward what comes next. The empire shattered into Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedon. Several small territories that came and went, like passing clouds. These kingdoms endured for centuries, longer than Alexander had ruled, longer than he had lived. Yet every one of them traced its origin back to the feverish night in Babylon, when the world's most ambitious young man went still. His generals fought over the pieces, his heirs died, his body was stolen. His legacy became a blueprint, a warning, and a puzzle. But the story isn't finished yet.